So the idea behind this book was very simple. We looked at the current literature on conflict, and we realized that a lot of what's been written about conflict does not really have a power to explain what's happening in the world right now, because either it used some, older references to older case studies, or use some models and theories that are no longer relevant. So we wanted to do something different. We wanted to look at conflict from more interdisciplinary perspective. So we wanted to look at conflict by asking scholars from different fields, specializing in different types of conflict, from interpersonal to systemic conflicts, to explain, so what's the nature of social and political conflict is now in 21st century. And I think this panel is going to give you a really nice summary of what we're trying to do. But here is a shameless promotion of the handbook. So please consider it, adopting for your libraries. And so we're gonna kick off this panel with the notion of illiberalism, and the presentation of Dr. Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University on Grassroots of Illiberal Politics.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sergei. Good morning, everybody. And yeah, as Sergei was just telling you, I will be launching this discussion on how do we try to think political and social conflict by bringing notion coming from political philosophy. And the one that I'm using, this rising concept, is the one of illiberalism, which is probably one of the most relevant if we want to understand what is happening both in Europe, but even more in these countries. It's really probably one of the main major prisms to capture the current transformation. So what do I mean by illiberalism? I mean a broad ideological family or universe that is challenging liberalism, that is telling us that either liberalism failed, either liberalism did something and then failed, and that we need to kind of challenge the cultural hegemony of liberalism. And of course, because liberalism means a lot of things. We can say liberalism as a political philosophy, liberalism as an economic principle, liberalism as a social, cultural kind of progressivism. So if liberalism is diverse, illiberalism is also as diverse, right? Because it's targeting different elements of liberalism. So this illiberalism is context dependent, and it's very sensitive to cultural context. So what does this illiberalism is promising us in terms of political philosophy? Well, it's telling us that nation-state sovereignty is more important than any kind of supranational institution. It's telling us that nations should have cultural homogeneity, and therefore that minorities, migrants, foreigners need to adapt to a cultural majority. Is telling us that we need respect for hierarchy, that we are not, as human beings, we are not kind of, a blank page on which we could put any identity. We have roots, we have genealogy, we have geography, we have space and time in us, and therefore we have traditional hierarchy that needs to be adapted, respected, on one way or another. And he's also telling us that we need more executive power and more majoritarianism to make democracy more efficient, right? So you see the how much it's relevant to the current political context we live. But what illiberalism is also telling us is that we don't need anymore the consensus, this culture of moderation, the culture of compromise, that's and kind of sharing, trying to find middle ground. That was a tradition coming from liberalism since the 18th century. So why is this term rising? Why are we not using just, anti-liberalism, far right, conservatism? There are a lot of other concepts that are possible. So why illiberalism? Well, because illiberalism is a kind of new mix that is adapted to the current world in which we live. It's still believing in some form of liberalism. For example, it's still believing in economic liberalism on many aspects. It's still believing in a kind of old-fashioned liberalism, from pre-transformation of the 60s, kind of white male-centric liberalism that we had in the 50s, but it's very much a postmodern phenomenon, right? It's mixing genre, it's really shaped by popular culture, entertainment, leisure, advertisement, merchandising, consumerist tradition, celebrity politics. And at the same time, it's connecting that with a cult of traditional conservative values of belonging. So it's this very postmodern mix of modernity in its consumerist aspect and cult of reinvented, reimagined traditional values. A key, I think, example of this kind of grassroots cultural rise of illiberalism that is matching our discussion today is the trad wife movement on social media. So this kind of recreation of traditional femininity and therefore traditional masculinity, which is very postmodern because it's talking to the millennials, it's talking to the Generation Z, pushing women out of the job market and inviting them to be good housewives, to recreate a kind of holistic identity where you don't have to be divided between your career and your family. You just have one identity, that to be a good housewife, cultivating classic beauty, but also cultivating nostalgia for white America, for a pre-civil right America, with all the cliche and the cultural production of what we could call Americana, all this kind of mythified vision of American kind of big national myth. And you have the same version arriving in Europe, but US is really leading in that kind of creation. And of course, it's also very postmodern because it's very much based on advertisement. It's an artificial creation of domesticity. It has a lot of money, business model in the background. All these trad wife influencers are also there to make money. So it's a business model. And so another aspect that I think is kind of matching our current discussion that we see around the concept of illiberalism is the idea of freeing language from moderation. And so if you are an illiberal, you have the right to be provocative, excessive, vulgar, and that element of is kind of it's seen as a sign of freedom. And you know the discussion we have currently in this country about freedom of speech. It's seen as a sign of rebellions, resistance, and it's valorizing all the kind of counterculture. You know, it's valorizing mafia culture, gang culture, street culture, and telling them that, wow, that's cool, right? That's what a new politician, what the new culture should be. It's to valorize this rebellious underground culture. So, of course, illiberalism is thriving now because it's very much connected and in harmony with the media ecosystem we have now that are focusing on incivilities, character assassination. So the whole business model of all our media ecosystem is just going perfectly well with what illiberalism is pushing for. But you have other elements that are more grassroots that explain that rise. You, of course, have a lot of social demands for testing new political and social, economic, and cultural models that wouldn't be the liberalism or the neoliberalism as we had it for the last 40 years. There is really this feeling in part of our citizen that, you know, the status quo should end. And then people are ready to test new political model, including taking risk at challenging democracy and trying some more authoritarian model. You have a lot of social economic reasons that are explaining that, but also, as I was saying, cultural reasons, this kind of post-truth culture. And we were mentioning in the first panel, the role of artificial intelligence reality. So you really have a blurry space between what is real, what is not. And you can see also the revival currently around not Trump himself, but Trumpism are the cultural phenomenon of dystopia and science fiction, which is, I think, a really important element to explain the part that citizens feel like you are just entering a new era with the unknown. And this unknown can be both awful and good at the same time. What matters is that it will be dramatically transforming the liberal status quo. And then we have a rising distrust, not only toward institutions that has been well studied, but also distrust toward us as citizens, right? And the level of polarization of this country has never been as high as we have it now. So there is also this feeling that we don't know what we share anymore as citizens, and that has to be reinvented. So just a few words of conclusion to show you that through political philosophy and concept like illiberalism, you can have a kind of philosophical background to help you thinking elements that are connected to the discussion we have today at the conference, and trying to look at political conflict in a much more kind of broad political culture phenomenon to explain that character assassination rise and the genderization of public discourse that we are studying today, they are not the exception, they are the new norm. That's why the illiberal culture will be, and that will be the new normal. And so all vision of that as a kind of exception or state of exception is just missing the point that we have moved away from the cultural hegemony of liberalism and enter a new kind of political culture where that will be the new norm. And on that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
But I think the structurational divergence theory takes one step forward, and I think provides a really sophisticated look at the world order we live in right now. And you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I want to start by saying the things have changed a lot since I wrote this paper, and not in an inconsistent way. But some of the recommendations, I think, at the end, I think a couple of ships have sailed, and that portion of the chapter would need to be rethought before applying things. It also occurred to me as I was preparing for this panel. Oh, and by the way, Marlene, I'm very sorry that the other people on this panel didn't get the purple jacket memo. We're kind of like at two ends of a printer, where mine was a little more saturated, so that's kind of fun. But it occurred to me in looking again over Marlene's work in a way that it hadn't before, and then hearing you speak kind of brought this home to me, that the kind of analysis that I'm doing here can really be part of an explanation for the rise of illiberalism, for what is some of the driving mechanism for the changes to culture that you are observing. So I just wanted to put that out there. Because I think that the things that I have to say might also help us understand the functions of illiberalism as well as how it has risen. So liberal, conservative, democratic, Republican, left and right even sometimes, these things do not mean what they used to mean. And they also all have less shared meaning than ever before. So what we call liberal, what we call conservative, what we call Democrat, what we call Republican, these things mean something different in a more variable way to different publics than I think ever before. And that's part of our challenges that Marlene has also identified, is that we really have lost a center of shared meaning across not just American culture, but political culture. So having said all that, structurational divergence theory is an extension of structuration theory. And just in case there are folks who don't know what that is, structuration theory is a traditional sociological theory that in sociology solved the problem of free will versus determinism, right? So if our behavior is determined, where are our choices? And so Giddens really solved that problem with structuration theory, which I'm in organizational communication, and pretty much every theory, if not every theory, Scott's in my class, so he'll tell you, I say this in class, the action structure pair is something you see in every organizational theory, that there's some enduring structure that enables and constrains our activities, and then our activities perpetuate and change those enduring structures. And so you can see this cycle. I used to see structures as deep, and now I kind of see things through more of a flatland perspective, which is where you see structure and action being constituted within one another rather than driving one another. So my theoretic thinking has even evolved a little bit since this writing. But structurational divergence theory is an attempt to explain what happens when we hit an impasse. In traditional structuration theory, there is, within the theory, there's a structure that says that when you have interpenetrating structures that compel us to behave in oppositional ways, that a third structure, it's all very neat and tidy, right? A third structure will naturally emerge that tells you which structure takes precedence or which structure to prioritize. The example I use in the paper is business structure versus family structure. So if I get a phone call in the middle of this presentation and I take that phone call, y'all are going to raise an eyebrow. All right. But if it's, I got to take this call, it's my kid's school, then everybody says, oh, okay. Right. And then I say, I got to go, my son's socks are dirty. What? No, I got to go because my son is in an ambulance right now being taken to the hospital, right? So these structures, these third and fourth and fifth and sixth, and there's always multiple, there's never just two, emerge to tell us, okay, what set of rules, what structure's in the driver's seat right now for my behavior. So it's all very neat and tidy in structuration theory, except what about when it's not? What about those situations where you have equally compelling oppositional rules and there is no neat and tidy structure that emerges that tells us which one takes precedence? And so this is what structurational divergence theory says happens. And most of our data is from healthcare contexts. There are a number of people, which is pretty gratifying as a scholar to see people you never heard of running with the theory that you created. But so there's been some stuff with athletic injuries and the structures that guide how we treat injuries, other kinds of things. Still health related. There's been some stuff on climate change using the theory. And so it's starting to be applied outside its original formation, which is what this is an attempt at. So Serge really talked me into saying, you really need to be looking at political communication. And I said, I do? I don't know if I do. But then I wrote this paper and he said, now you see? And I said, oh yeah, now I see. So structurational divergence theory says that when these two structures come together, and there's two basic, really broad, rough categories in which this happens. It's when one person faces, I either need to do this or I need to do that, and I'm between a rock and a hard place. That's one expression of it, which frankly has been studied more. What we're talking about here is when you have multiple groups, and in this case, identity groups, who are pulling apart a single system. Okay, so structurational divergence can happen within a single person or within a culture. So you have one structure that doesn't match another structure, and you end up with this really, instead of a nice, neat gray circle or a nice, neat gray triangle, which is what you'd have if they matched, you end up with this really muddled kind of social system. And the documentation of this cycle in organizational cyclic conflict, we have seen it in our data over and over and over and over again. So I'm very confident that this works in organizational context. After what I've read, we don't have data from political context. This is all theoretical, but from everything that I have read, I can clearly see it now in that literature as well. So you have these unresolvable conflicts that create a form of immobilization, which is not doing nothing. It's getting nowhere, right? So rather than people being frozen, think people on a hamster wheel. The more that you try and the more that you try and the more that you try, the problem that you're trying to solve only becomes worse. And this is not typical substantive garden variety conflict because those conflict management techniques do not work in SD. So you end up with this erosion of human development, erosion of cultural development, erosion of organizational development in a way that simply deepens and exacerbates that presenting divergence, so you have this really kind of stultifying downward spiral, and it is not a fun experience, and we see it everywhere, right? We can see this pattern happening everywhere. So what I'm doing is applying it to identity politics. So what I'm doing here is following a concept of political sectarianism. The citations and everything are in the paper, but the idea here is that we are beyond polarization to actual sectarianism, where the marching orders of the day, the third structure that emerges, is one that casts the other group, right? That dichotomizes the two groups and each casting the other as the enemy. So there's a demonization of the other that happens between political identity groups that says, you are wrong. If you're wrong on this, you're wrong on everything, and I must oppose you. So it displaces any goal that we have, because our goal then becomes to defeat the other evildoer. And you can see this in the rhetoric, in the political rhetoric in the last 2-3 election cycles, and before that too, but it dominates now, right? So it turns into this name calling, right? So I used to think of myself as a conservative Democrat, and now I have no idea where I fit in this reality, except to say, could I please be out of this reality? Could I please not even be in it? Because I don't know where I fit, right? And I have family members who the political rhetoric would call us enemies, and we cannot find where we disagree. We just cannot find issues. My brother and I, in particular, we cannot find an issue upon which we would disagree. He's a lifelong Republican. I'm a lifelong Democrat. And so it has become this confusing environment where the politics of the day, particularly on Capitol Hill, and we see it in other governments as well, becomes this vanquish the other. And it bubbles up into everyday community communication in calling people names, in the illiberal kind of culture that we've had developed. So we have this third structure that tells us to vanquish the other. If you are one of them, then I have to reject any notion of community in between us. And furthermore, all of them must be defeated. So what happens in government is an inability to govern, right? And so in the paper, I use what at the time seemed to be really extreme things and now kind of pale in comparison. So I use the example of the government shutdown in 2023, where, unprecedented, 21 days without after McCarthy was ousted, 21 days without a speaker. That is unprecedented in American history. And if you look at government shutdowns from the mid 80s to present, there have been 10 or 12 shutdowns, the longest being 35 days, I think was 2017 or 18. So the shutdowns get more dire. And so these stopgap measures have become the order of the day rather than a rare occurrence, right? Stopgap is not supposed to be something that is, just an ordinary measure, and has become that, right? Because it has become this, I can't possibly vote with you because you're over there, right? And I'm over here. So as an aside, this is not in the paper, but this is something I've been thinking for a really long time. What if in Congress, we have the metaphor of the aisle, which becomes a trench, right? Which becomes, that is actually a physical division of the us and the them. What if we made the seats DR, 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 right? This is the danger of a two-party system, frankly, because once you have two, the enemy is clear when these politics emerge. But what if you had to say, oh, excuse me, when you walked by your enemy? What if you had to bend over and pick up a pen and invade somebody else's space? And the normal interaction of human civility humanized the other, right? Because right now, the political operatives are demonizing one another. And then you have bad actors who are doing that fear mongering. So this is not in the paper, but I want to make two observations that I think are really important, especially given this morning's presentations. Number one, never underestimate the power of racism. And number two, never underestimate the extent to which people will find acceptable things that they would in a previous life have found abhorrent because they are afraid. So we have bad actors who instill this fear, which make people accept things that they would never have accepted before, because we have this trench happening. I will tell you, I'm happy to share. Of course, you need to get the book, right? Can I share my chapter? I'm happy to share this version of the paper if you want. There's an example in there of a coffee shop. Yes, it really happened. It's not on the list of, of all the things that never happened before, this never happened the most. It's not on that list. I actually watched two people get into a fight in front of me at a Starbucks. I sanitized it, to use it as an example in the paper because the language that was used was a little more salty than the example that I used. But this woman ordered a latte with some non-dairy milk in it. And the guy behind her started muttering under his breath because apparently non-dairy milk is un-American. And they ensued to have this fight. The poor guy, very young guy, barista was just, what am I supposed to do? They're calling each other idiots. They're swearing at each other. She goes on to describe in great detail, what would happen to her if she drank dairy milk. And how stupid do you have to be to not understand lactose intolerance? He gets disgusted. He leaves. She is just jubilant, right? She turns around and I'm supposed to share in her joy, and I didn't. And then I ordered an oat milk latte. So that was kind of fun because I like it. But this is the kind of thing we're seeing happening in our neighborhoods. We're seeing people who say, I would never date a person like that, right? People are calling each other names. And it is just because of this us and them sectarianism, which can be explained by structurational divergence theory. I'm not going to get into the recommendations because I don't know that, given that we have gone so far into the illiberal world, that some of the things that I talk about with recommendations are feasible anymore. But I think that structurational divergence theory can help us to put some conceptual framework around where we have gotten and how do we break this cycle. I will tell you that in our organizational work, the thing that most powerfully breaks the cycle is awareness of it. So I leave you with a field of dreams, which is the metaphor that we use in training. So the movie, right? There's invisible ghost baseball players. The brother-in-law thinks they're crazy. Why do you have a baseball field instead of in farmland? And just wants them to sell and get out. And then something happens and he can suddenly see the players. And he says, you cannot sell this farm. This is really special. I see it. Once you see the baseball players, you cannot unsee them. And this has been our experience in organizational settings, that once people see why they're in this cycle, the people that they're fighting against conceptually become somebody with whom they share a problem instead of somebody who is an enemy. And the problem becomes the enemy. So that, I think, is something that could apply. Some of the more specific things in the paper, I think it's gone a little too far for those things to work anymore. But I do think that awareness of these invisible structures that are pulling us apart, I think that this theory has the potential to change it just by seeing it. Thank you. Whoops. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter is Stephen Livingston from the George Washington University, and he will talk about vitriolic politics of identity in contemporary America.
Thank you. I also get to reuse a PC after many years.
Should be yours somewhere. Desktop.
I don't know. I don't see it. I sent it to you in your inbox. Oh, here. Yes.
You can be.
Nope, not me.
Yeah.
Yep. Nope, not me.
Okay. Well, we can begin it.
Well, hi, I'm Steve Livingston from George Washington University, and while we look for my PowerPoint, which is meant to be a visual aid as you listen to me talk anyway, we can get started. I want to begin by simply saying what an honor it is to be included in the book. It's terrific. I want to also acknowledge Lorcan Neal, a former graduate student of mine who's now a PhD student at UNC, who is a co-author with me in this. I can tell you that the intention, once we find my PowerPoint, there it is. Thank you. I appreciate it. All set? Yep. Great. Is this working?
Yeah. Here you turn this one up.
As I was saying, the intention I have for this talk is actually could be understood as an effort at describing the engine, the organizational engine that drives liberal democracies into illiberalism. Here's the point of the talk. It borrows from organizational theory literature, but also the very much older political science literature that looked at the nature of civil society organizations, the differences between prime ministers and presidential systems. There's a large body of work in political science, sociology, history, and economics that asks questions about the structure of society, the features of society, the nature of income and wealth inequality that play an important role in whether or not a liberal democracy will drift over into illiberalism. I think that's important. In some measure, I have to tell you, there's an implicit and in a couple of instances, quite explicit critique of the media effects understanding that drives so much of political communication research. And the critique is this, that kind of framing of the problem of illiberalism drives the conversation into cognitive function. Politics becomes a matter of the brain rather than a matter of the kind of society in which we live in. And so the effort that I have with a variety of colleagues here is to actually be cognizant of, yes, there are media effects, but at the same time, let's not lose sight of the nature of the society, the major features of the society in which we live that might actually play a central role in the development of an illiberal regime. So that's the overall objective. Let me say the way we do that is to change the nature of our understanding of what a civil society organization is. We come to treat routinized online communication on Facebook groups, on hashtags, on subreddits as a kind of organization. So I'm going to encourage you in my talk to think of QAnon or incel groups as a kind of organization. And when we match that with the existing political science literature on the way in which some kinds of civil society organizations have a detrimental effect on democracy, the argument is going to be that what we see as the engine of illiberalism is the coherence of illiberal ideas online and offline that pull democracies into illiberalism. That means that the driver, the fuel of that kind of online content is exactly what Eric and Jennifer and others have looked at, but we don't treat it as individual effects. We see it as a kind of organization. So that's if I run out of time, you've got the whole conversation or the whole point of the paper right there. I have to take a moment. Most of what you will hear me talk about right now is actually currently in publication someplace. A lot of what I will be talking about is found in Perspectives on Politics with my colleague Lance Bennett. Perspectives on Politics is one of the American Political Science Association's journals, and this is currently available and it's open access, so you can download it for free. Also, I draw on a book that's coming out with Oxford University Press here fairly soon. And then also I'm very honored to be in Illiberal Studies Program's journal that Marlene heads up. There's a critique of the individual level media effects literature in that particular article. There's also one other article that's coming out, but I'll set that aside for just a second. So here's my point again. Vitriolic speech, including attempted character assassination, can be placed in a theoretical framework involving democratic regression, illiberalism, the effects of extreme social and economic inequality is one of the drivers of that. I'm drawing on a number of scholars within the scholarly community, interestingly enough, and importantly enough, Daniel Ziblatt is one of them. It's interesting because Ziblatt is not working in the media field at all. He's interested in the historical sort of evolution of how different organizations in the historical context of the rise and fall of democracy in Europe played out. The gist of his argument is in some instances, some kinds of civil society organizations, such as during the Weimar Republic in Germany, pulled the conservative parties in Germany into fascism. In other instances, approximately the same time, Daniel says that in the UK, for example, some kinds of civil society organizations helped to stabilize the Tories' crisis around an early election in the early part of the 20th century. So here the question is what kind of organizations exist in the environment, civil society organizations, that may pull us into either illiberalism or help stabilize democracy? That's the overall gist of it. That's Ziblatt. He looks most closely at conservative parties, and I want to really signal something that's important for us to understand. Others, including me, but also Hacker and Pearson at Yale and Berkeley, respectively, have tried to apply Ziblatt's model to the United States, and it's been most often focusing on the GOP, on the Republican Party. Why? Well, because it's the one that's presumably being pulled most clearly into illiberalism. We're a bit more expansive. We treat the Democratic Party as a sort of neoliberal light party that has sort of shadowed many of the features of the Republican Party. So we can talk about it more if you want with Q&A, but we actually blend together. We don't just single out the Republican Party for our analysis. What Ziblatt says, though, basically is that conservatives and conservative parties face a crisis in a democracy. Number one, they're most clearly aligned with the wealthiest elements of society. Yet in a democracy, they need to figure out a way of winning an election. How to do that? How can you run for office when you're most closely aligned with elites, with economic elites? And so that's the conundrum that they face. So this is called the conservative dilemma. Stephen, whom I've known, one of the nice things about this conference is I get to see people I've known for a very, very long time. Couple of years, right, Stephen and Eric? Stephen asked me what countries I've been in recently because I have a reputation as something of an IR scholar at one point in my career of being interested in democracy and the state of democracy everywhere else. More recent years, I brought that interest home to the United States. So I spent much of this past year in Flint, Michigan, trying to understand why people in Flint might be drawn to illiberal ideas. This is not a war zone. That's a church that's left over, like a lot of the detritus of the post-industrial age in a place like Flint, Michigan. These sorts of hollowed out structures are everywhere. I mean by showing this picture to emphasize the kinds of social context that Daniel Ziblatt thinks produces this conservative dilemma. That is to say, how can a conservative party win an election in a democracy, especially in the midst of such gross economic inequality? I don't really need to belabor these data points. You know them well, just the extraordinary degree to which the United States has economic disparity. Relatively, 3 people own the same amount as the bottom 160 million Americans, et cetera. That's an important part of this model, to be aware of that. So you can put it this way: what happens when an economic system that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few coexists in a political system that gives the ballot to the many? How can you sort that out? How can you expect to run and win? Well, the way in which you do that is 2 ways, and this is the crux of the matter. Here's the heart of my model that I'm sharing with you that can be found in those publications I noted earlier. One, the answer to the conservative dilemma is the conservative parties need to find cross-cutting cleavage issues, a lovely political science term. It just sends chills up and down my back to say things like that. In other words, find issues that can build a cross-class coalition. Well, you can't run on economics and expect to do that, so you find others. You find other kinds of issues. They can't be temporary. They need to be strong. They need to pull at a sense of identity, a sense of meaning that might be missing in a highly unequal environment where you may not have a good income or be able to buy a house. So in short, there needs to be a non-economic issue, mostly or many of them racially tinged, all involving strong identities and strong emotions, and draw a sharp line between us and them. So in general, cross-cutting cleavage issues are about identity threats. They are deeply emotionally designed to replace consideration of economics. In the time I have remaining, well, let's focus on this, but by focusing public attention on social and cultural cleavages rather than economic divisions, as Hacker and Pearson say, without destabilizing the country's politics, how can you do that? Or do they end up promoting conflicts that are increasingly divisive, dangerous, and uncontrollable? I was just identified and spoken of just before me. You are playing with fire with cross-cutting cleavage issues. Now remember, the point is to pull together a cross-class coalition. How can conservative parties do that? They do it through assistance. They do it not just on their own, but by drawing on other organizations in society that help promote those issues. If you are from the United States, you are very well versed in the National Rifle Association's role, or the evangelical Christian community's role in being surrogates for the Republican Party, helping to promote these issues that are intended to build a cross-class coalition. This is just, I'll let you look at this, but now here's the key in the 2 minutes I probably have left, or 3 minutes, I hope. Surrogate organizations or surrogate groups may seem like a positive for political parties looking for a way of actually winning. The problem is often surrogate organizations actually become more powerful than the party itself. They start to take over or dominate the party's agenda. We would say that the party becomes porous. In other words, its ideological boundaries become porous to extremist content. That's just with conventional surrogate organizations. The party can fall into a spiral of weakening control over its most extreme elements. You see that from time to time if you think of Fox News as a GOP surrogate organization. Now, let's jump ahead. Here's the point. What Bennett and I do and others in combination do is we understand, as I said at the beginning of my talk, and as I'm saying at the end of the talk, we understand, we treat with some work that was done by Lance Bennett, The Logic of Connective Action, a famous book in my field. We treat online routinized communication, like a hashtag, a Facebook group, anything that brings together people with a common set of value structures, a common set of purposes that can allocate values and resources. All of these online groups have that capacity to do it. Now, here's the thing. If you think that sometimes surrogate organizations are dangerous for conservative parties when they are conventional, knock on the door surrogate organizations, when they are online, they become largely unmanageable. They have an autonomy that makes it difficult to control their expression. So you end up with Marjorie Taylor Greene as an example, or Lauren Bobbitt, and other expressions of extremism. The party boundaries become deeply porous, and you end up pulling that party into illiberalism. I don't want to take more time from Stephen's presentation, so if I've left anything unclear, there'll be time for Q&A. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't go too over.
Okay, and so Steve Farnsworth is going to talk about the role of political humor and ridicule in today's media. Yeah, so you can begin and I'll.
Well, Thanks so much for being here and being part of this conversation. I think what's really important is the extent to which we can learn from each other about something that's very, very new in the way that we think about politics. My conversation today is a part of a collaboration with Bob Lichter and Farah Latif. Farah, show wave your hand so that everyone knows who she is. She's Dr. Farah Latif. And the project here is really trying to connect some of the issues of disinformation and political humor as a mechanism for thinking about what's going on. I think one of the things that we often struggle with as scholars is trying to find solutions. I think we're all really good at finding problems, and that's a kind of a bleak conversation, and we all do it. But this challenge, I think, is an immense one when we start thinking about what can possibly work, because it's a bleak presentation that we have as we look at the challenges that we're facing. With respect to disinformation, what's important to recognize is that there are two things that are really, really important as we consider it in the context of character assassination. You know, oftentimes people come across much worse because of the deceits, the lies that are being told about them. This is true for political systems. It's true for individual political actors. And so as we think about those challenges, we really have to recognize that there is, at the core of our conversation today, a media environment that really is very inclined to build upon the impact of disinformation narratives. It is an environment where traditional media that tries to do the fact-checking or whatever is not only financially constrained, but is also facing an environment where the audience is tiny for what they have to do compared to people of a certain age, remembering when the network television's voice or the New York Times voice was really dominant and was in a position to counter whatever false information that we out there. I'm sorry?
It's not opening, sorry. You have to do impromptu. We have some visuals to show.
So we have no PowerPoint.
So it didn't download for some reason. So, sorry.
Okay, well, we will work with it. In the research that I'm doing, there is a great deal of attention that comes to these false and unproven claims that are out there in the world of disinformation. And they have a really, really powerful dynamic as we consider real world activities as well as public opinion. If you're thinking, for example, about character assassination as it relates to, say, COVID, we can talk about disinformation in the context of it being character assassination that's anti-elite. We could talk about it being character assassination in the context of it being anti-government. We can talk about it in the context of being anti-science. And so you have, in many ways, a multi-pronged attack on evidence, on established authority, on the dynamics of our political environment. And we can see as we look at where that information is most likely to flourish, the disinformation, it is, of course, in the areas of social media above all. When you ask people, where did you hear about powerful people planning COVID? Where did you hear about vitamin C as a solution to COVID? Where do you hear about the connection between 5G and the COVID virus? Over and over again, the answer, more than anywhere place else, is social media, an environment that is really, really bad at countering disinformation. It is an environment where disinformation flourishes because people wish it were true, or they want to believe it's true, or it serves their political purposes to act as if it were true. And the challenges of fact-checking in these are well known to us all. Even if they're trying, they're doing a lousy job, and it's not clear to me that they're really trying. Now, but the consequences are even more profound than that. When we think about, say, COVID vaccination rates, again, disinformation is a really, really powerful dynamic. If you look at the states that had the highest vaccination rates in the United States, and you look at the states with the lowest vaccination rates in the United States, you have a dynamic that is very much blue versus red. The only blue state in terms of the 2020 presidential election that is in the bottom 10 in terms of vaccination rates is Georgia, and that's a state where Trump famously wanted those last 12,000 votes. It was really the purplest of all the purple states. And again, this is real world consequences. This disinformation about the challenges that to the vaccines, the challenges to science, the challenge to elite political authority, all of that is a decision that people are making to put their families at risk, to put themselves at risk, to put everyone they know and they love at risk by choosing to dismiss all the science in favor of a narrative that is favored by a political team that they see themselves as on. And so it's not trivial in the slightest. It's not a casual impact. And it's not just a political one. It is a choice that people are making in their daily lives that have immense impacts. Now, I could, of course, in this conversation, have talked about excess per capita death rates, but let's not be too morbid. It's the same blue versus red dynamic, even though, of course, a contagious disease is more likely to flourish in a big city than in a small town. When we look at how this relates to vote choice, of course, we see the same basic challenges. If you look, for example, at misinformed views, once again, these are largely found, above all, among people who watch conservative news. They watch Fox News, they watch conservative media. They're much more likely to believe things that aren't true or not to believe that something is true. And so these kinds of dynamics, once again, create false information about policy. And the idea, of course, of disinformation is a three-mechanism approach for success of disinformation. If you believe something that's false is true, if you believe something that's true is false, or if you believe that there is no truth out there, that there's just so much in the way of challenging information. Any of those things is a victory for disinformation, and it is a defeat, of course, for any sort of capacity of a society to deal with its challenges in a fact-based way. It's not going to surprise you how this plays out, of course, in presidential elections in the United States. Republicans are much more likely to believe that crime is at an all-time high in the 2024 election. They're much more likely to believe that inflation is increasing even as it started to decline. They're much more inclined to believe that the stock market, even something as visible as that, is lower than it actually is, because that's the narrative that they want about America being a mess going into the 2024 election. So the falsity shapes personal life. It shapes personal views. It shapes all kinds of risks. And so with that sort of bleak introduction, what about political humor? And how can political humor be a possible connection to what's going on here? And this is a dynamic, I think, that is really something that's very distinct in the 2020 data that we looked at. And I'm not sure whether we're looking at a long-term pattern or not. But in terms of 2020, we saw a significant departure from the way that political humor has shaped public opinion. Traditionally, political humor generates increased cynicism about viewers, from the viewers, about politicians, about the political system, and the like. But in 2020, in our data, in our public opinion survey, we found that it actually had the exact opposite impact, that it actually increased political trust if you saw these political humor programs during the election season. Now, you might wonder who is actually learning about politics through political humor? And the answer is many more people than you might think. About 20% of Virginia adults. We did a Virginia survey, but Virginia is relatively close to national dynamics, and I can defend that further. I do in the paper. But the reality is that that's, of course, a disproportionately younger sample, but that is impacted by political humor. But it is across the dynamics. Now, the fact that about a quarter of people in our survey learned about news, learned about the presidential election from political humor, I mean, those numbers are not as high as they would be for television, for actual news organizations. We shouldn't expect them to be comparable, but it's still quite high. And it orients itself towards an audience that is not particularly consuming a lot of news, not really connected all that much to the political environment. It is in many ways, it is for lack of a better way to put it, a gateway drug to politics. A joke about Mitch McConnell isn't funny if you don't know who Mitch McConnell is. And so you have to learn a little bit about politics to get the jokes, to get the humor. And so it is a mechanism for approaching people, challenging disinformation in a way that is not threatening. I mean, if a Democrat says that the Republican is lying, people say, well, no, I'm a Republican, the Democrat's lying. But if a comic says this, and again, we're talking about somebody who isn't running for office, we have a less threatening narrative that is out there, and an opportunity, particularly for those people who don't have the most well-formed political views, also disproportionately younger adults, that maybe they can be challenged on the disinformation claims. I am so sorry, we do not have are the ability to show you a PowerPoint, because I have a logistic regression equation that asks this question and looks at statistically what's going on here. And we find that that when you learn about from politics about late night comedy, we find that trust in the U.S. goes up. And in this multivariate equation, we find that this interrelationship between trust and learning about politics from political humor is more important than education, presidential vote, ideology, party idea. The only variable in our model that is more important for the connection between learning about political humor is age, which is, of course, the dynamic of this being a very young-oriented group. And so, I go to some trouble. I have some statistics, but you'll have to, I've got it here. But the bottom line is, what is going on here? And this is one of the areas where I'm going further in the future, because I'm trying to see about what I'm looking at here as it relates to the 2020 context. My initial thought is that this may be a one-off thing. Remember, January 6th happens. And so in many ways, the idea that late night comedy that focuses on Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was the subject of about 90% of the jokes relating to the presidential election in 2020. The idea is that late night comedy that focuses on Trump is connected to system strengthening activities because Donald Trump was so aggressively involved in the January 2021 attack on the Capitol. Our survey went into the field after January 6th. It went in that summer. And so we're in a position to say that, by attacking somebody who's attacking the political system, political humor is creating something very different than what we've seen from political humor historically. It is now a system building dynamic that is in play, at least as it relates to 2020. This research leaves us with a couple of questions going forward. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in this question of whether 2020 is an outlier. It's certainly different from every other year that we've looked at political humor and its impact on politics. But also, I think it's interesting to consider the rise of conservative humor. The Gutfeld program, of course, is now a comparable show in terms of ratings to the traditional late night shows of network television and The Daily Show. And so with that, we may be looking at a very different dynamic of political humor and its impacts going forward. And so what I'm going to be doing, if you're kind enough to invite me again, is talk about Gutfeld and what's going on there, because this may be a solution to the conservative problem of being mocked so much more than liberals on late night television. Thank you all.
All right. So we apologize again to Steve for not able to show his visual, but we'll share all the slides with the participants here. So now it's time for Q&A. So we have 15 minutes and then we have food awaiting us.
Thank you so much. It was so impressive. So thank you for all your presentations. I have a question for Stephen. So, sorry, for you, Mr. Professor Livingston. My question is about conservative dilemma, since it deals with a question, refers to the question how to deal with a system in which wealth is accumulated in hands of the few and the ballot is given is in the hands of the many. So since the liberals help co-create the system, my question is there a liberal dilemma? And how would you define it?
Yeah, that actually is a question that came up recently in response to the Perspective on Politics article. I would say that the United States has been experiencing a dearth of liberal anything. It would be my response. In other words, since about 1996, with the Clinton administration signing on to the same neoliberal project that Reagan had signed on to earlier, Gary Gerstel's book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, is the place to go to for this particular thought, but that in others, there are many others, that the Democratic Party finds itself in the position it finds itself in right now, not knowing quite what it's about, is because, whereas the Republican Party is sort of, I think, well, they've given up on neoliberalism in complicated ways that we don't have time to go into now. The Democrats still don't know what they are about except for neoliberal light. And you saw this with Kamala Harris running with Liz Cheney. You know, when the Cheneys are endorsing you as a Democratic presidential candidate, you should be scratching your head. So that's the best I can do to answer your question.
Please tell me, all of you, but if I'm wrong, it's a very, very quick question. As my late beloved mentor, Lee Siegelman, used to tell to all of us, oh, well, it was much worse in 1968. Are we exaggerating that? Look at this, 68 for women, threats to end feminism. Nixon is winning. Democrats in complete disarray in Chicago, fighting one another. Republicans bored to death with this uninspiring candidate. Threats of national ban on abortion. So character attacks against women relentless. Well, basically for being openly gay, just you're mentally ill. You're mentally ill. So no question about being openly bisexual or just talk about gender identity. I think the time was much worse then than right now. We simply just egotistically believe that our time is most important, and that's why. Tell me I'm wrong and character attack me just without any mercy. 68.
Talk about France in 68.
Paris, 68. She's going to answer Paris.
Yeah. So first, yeah, it's an American example that you're giving that wouldn't work for Western Europe. So that's one thing. A second one is that, of course, each period of time is arriving with its own progressivism and its own type of backlash, right? So you can say that you had regularly a kind of, progressive moment and then a backlash, and then it's moving like that. I think the difference is now is that you have a growing part of our public opinion that doesn't believe anymore in things that were obvious in 68 for both camps, which is some form of liberalism, even if it's a conservative in terms of values, but still believing in 68 that, political liberalism, in sense your right as an individual were there. Because what you are mentioning is a kind of conservative societal value backlash. What you have now is a backlash that it's a much bigger one, and that is a backlash on liberalism as a political philosophy and as a democratic institution. One of the difference also with 68 is that at that time you still had a large part of the society that had some form of utopia. You could imagine what the future would be and what you would be hoping for your kids. I think now we are, and that going back to what Steve was saying, in a world where there is no utopia except the conservative retro utopia that is telling you the best we can do in the future is to try to go back on some aspect, or a kind of dystopian future, kind of Elon Musk, augmented human beings going to Mars, which is in fact a very old utopia, a very old industrialized kind of science fiction. Or you have the leftist kind of climate change, utopia, like if we don't change radically, then it will just be hell on earth. That's not super attractive, right? So all the kind of, progressivist, socialist utopia has disappeared. And I think that has a huge impact on the kind of declinisms, right? If you ask Americans and Europeans now, do you think your kids would be living better than you? It's majoritarily no. It was not the case in 68. So if you think, okay, it's messy now in 68, but my next generation will be better, it's one thing. If you think it's messy now and it will be worse for the next generation, it's a totally different political environment.
Thank you. Forgive me. This is something I'm very passionate about, so I'll try not to be too soapboxy about it. This critique is going to sound very pointed at the panelists, but this is more so a critique to the field. How can we bring these topics into the wider public's awareness? I fear we get very ivory tower with terms like sectarianism and illiberalism and the conservative dilemma that would likely not reach middle America or those with a lower reading level or those with a lack of a higher education. The people who we need to hear these concepts the most are often barred from truly engaging with them because of the spaces we discuss them in and the language we use. So I ask, how can we bring these concepts into the wider public's awareness and make them accessible?
Well, I think that's a great point. I can give you an example of colleagues who were coming exactly with your arguments and has proposed for the 2024 election to work with Democrats in trying to produce that kind of knowledge for young Americans with no college education. And the response from the Democratic Party was like, we don't need it.
Yeah, I guess also too, even though I do respect what you're saying, and a flippant part of me would say, well, just in my case, just listen to Bernie Sanders and you've got it, right? We need to pay attention to wealth inequality and the oversaturation of political power in the hands of a handful of corporations. That's basically my message. It's also his. But I would want to push back and say that actually the role of an intellectual is to think at this level of thought with this arcane language, then that if it has any merit at all, if it has any traction, if it explains what it's supposed to explain, then there are other layers of civil society, other layers of the political arena, journalists, think tanks that have the role of translating arcane ideas into policy language. So it's meant to percolate its way down. There are people, at least I hang out with, who would say, it's not my role to lead the masses. My role is to think about how we got where we are and maybe think about, in defining the problem, also suggesting how we get out of it. If you understand the problem correctly, that's the first step in figuring out how to get out of it. And that's how I see my role. Could I add one more thing? And again, I don't mean to be critiquing my beloved colleagues who I have as well. One of the challenges I have with the current state of intellectual discourse is that we have too much of a habit of condensing politics into brain function. It's not so much here, but I'm thinking of Lillian Mason. I'm thinking of Nyan and Reifler and my great friend Ethan Porter and Tom Wood, who are looking at these kinds of issues of democratic backsliding and saying, well, it's all a function of how the brain works. No, that doesn't get us anywhere. We can't tweak a message in a way that's going to somehow reverse Trumpism. We have to address the root social causes. And in my view, that's income and wealth inequality, it's racism, it's misogyny, it's the kinds of power structures in society that lead to alienation and anger.
If you want a different voice of liberalism in politics, well, then you can start by talking to the Democrats about what they're doing and what they're not doing. As my colleague just mentioned, that there are voices within the Democratic Party that are reflecting many of the things that we're talking about here. But the reality is that the situation of the environment now, the media environment that is so extraordinarily incapable of dealing with falsehood, that it is a battle that is an overwhelming challenge. Even if we imagine, the Democratic Party was populated by the Bernies of the world, and it's not. And
we know that, don't
yeah, and so that reality is a problem that I don't feel personally responsible for. I'm not going to run for anything. I don't want to run for anything. And so I think my job is to raise the issues that I raise, and I think increasingly we need to consider these less about the brain functions and more about the emotional connections. And political humor, I think, is one of the ways in which we can move away from that kind of deterministic model. And I think that I do want to say one thing about '68. If we'd had the media environment today that we had in '68, that would have been a very different ending to that era, be Vietnam and Watergate, both, because we had so much more capacity to deal with disinformation 50 years ago than we do today in our media environment. And we are all the poorer for it.
Yeah, I want to counter with a question. Right. What is the mechanism where the default now is polarized and partisan? Right? I mean, what even does the term nonpartisan even mean anymore? Right? So if you the default not just for politicians and elected officials, but for your neighbors, right? For the folks in communities that Scott is talking about, is mistrust and division. That is our default. And so, one of the examples I use in the paper is Kyle Rittenhouse, shooting people up in the street in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And there was a Pew survey that divided respondents into Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And the pattern is really interesting. So it was while the trial was going on, asking the public, do you think he should be convicted? And the pattern is really, really clear. Overwhelmingly, people who identified as a Democrat, at 76% people said he should be convicted. And people who identified as Republican, something like 60%, 60-something percent said that he should be acquitted. For independents, it was 40-40-20, 20 being no opinion. So clearly and I would like to add to that when Pew does surveys about how well people think their officials are governing, they use the term the opposition party as a faux neutral label that we have embedded in political rhetoric and just in the minds of everyday people, that if you're a D or an R, if you're a blue or a red, frankly, I think the blue-red stuff that started with the 2004 elections is a huge part of the language problem, because it puts it into a nice, neat little box that you now don't have to think about it, oversimplifies it. So how did we get to this point where the presumption that something will be partisan has become the default? I don't know the answer to that question. And, political communication is not my main area of study, so I'm kind of at a loss, for where we would go for that explanation. But when Pew can unproblematically, as if it's a foregone conclusion, call our two main political parties oppositional in a simple adjective, how well do you think your political party that you belong to is dealing with communicating with its opposition, meaning the other party? That, to me, when I read that, I'm very keen into language. How do we use language? And what, when we're tripping over language like that in a way that we're not even seeing it, right? We're just kind of up above it. That, to me, is a huge indicator that this culture of opposition has become our default. And I think that's a huge difference between now and 1968.
Excuse me? May I, thank you for having a chance to comment to Professor Livingston. I like your term cross-class coalition very much, because I remember after the Obama election in 2008, our German media reported that US Republicans will never vote elections again. So because of the economic and the social issue, they will never vote elections. And the cross-class coalition worked very well. I remember the Brexit referendum in 2016. The Cambridge data guys, they told there are millions of votes out there. Nobody knows. Nobody has an idea about these voters. They never go to vote. We have to activate them. And they did. So watch election days. If the percentage of voting, the voting participation is high on election day, you can do a last-minute bet on a conservative or on a far-right wing, because these voters tend to go to the right. That's what my idea was doing Brexit, and it tend to be right even this year or last year. Thank you.
Here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the panel. I am surprised, but not surprised how well this panel meshed together. In my mind, that all the topics were a little different, but under the umbrella of illiberalism, they all seated very well. So thank you for that. Just a few days ago, I heard a commentary, a political commentary about AOC. If she was on any further left, she would be a Tea Party Republican. And it reminded me of a the shoe horse paradox. And so I'm afraid I may not be able to articulate my question very well, but I am wondering how the other extremes, so in other words, so I'm thinking about the conservative humor or the liberal or neoliberal states of minds or politics or culture, or the conservative dilemma. Like, how do the other extremes may push or generate illiberalism? So my question is for the entire panel.
Well, I think one of the challenges that conservative humor has had historically is that if you are supportive of authority and the status quo, the iconoclastic nature of humor is kind of a challenge. One could, if you think about what Fox News talks about, how do you make it funny? I mean, you could produce jokes about the homeless, but I don't think that there's an audience for that. You could make jokes about people coming to America on the top of La Bestia, the train coming across Mexico. You could make jokes about these people going weeks without adequate food or nutrition or shelter, but I again don't think that is a commercially successful strategy. And what Gutfeld has done, and this is, I think, the one way that conservative humor can work, is you just simply are iconoclastic, not about political authority, but more about cultural authority. And so you make fun about the Hollywood elites. You talk about the professoriate. We're a common target, by the way, of conservative humor. And those sorts of resentments, are not challenging to the conservative mindset about politics, because you have that kind of opportunity. So I do think that there is a dynamic that is very successfully done in Gutfeld. And again, because this audience skews younger when we're talking about political humor, this is, I think, another warning sign to the Democrats about, particularly about younger white males, especially in terms of the dynamics of the electorate going forward. Because traditionally, you think about people in their 20s and their teens as being kind of anti-authority. And what Gutfeld does is, in some ways, helps give them reasons to be pro-authority. And that is a challenging environment that, one of the many ways that the Democrats seem largely incapable of dealing with at the moment.
I know we're over time. I would just very quickly add that, it's been documented through polling data, et cetera, exit polling data, that a lot of Bernie supporters switched over to Trump. The difference between Trump and Bernie is Sanders tends to punch up at corporations, and Trump punches down at immigrants and others.
Okay, we have time for the next question, and then we conclude the panel.
I'll do it out of microphone. My question is for Professor Livingston. You mentioned the cross-cutting cleavage issues, and there seem to be two parts. One is obvious, the culture war, and the second one you said was non-economic reasons. Right. Aren't the numbers showing that the reasons Trump won the election were kitchen table issues that have to do with economics and people not being able to meet the problems with inflation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can't answer it empirically right now. We would just have to trade data, because a counter argument would be, in the environment where I've spent the last year, trans issues, the idea that Democrats are supporting trans, all of that was driving, and that would be a cross-cutting cleavage issue. Whereas, but you're right. It could be the case that if inflation was a driver in this past election cycle, and I was looking at the exit polling data, I haven't been able to get back to it because of all of the other writing I've been doing. But yeah, that would be a counterexample to the thesis I've offered. Could be on eggs. Yeah.
There's just one parting comment. I've long been of the opinion, I don't have data on this, but I've long been of the opinion that the rise of Trump is related to people who have felt invisible, feeling seen. And it seems that he does not need to provide a solution to the problems he identifies, that somebody finally sees how I think and sees my problem. A vast number of American people who were ignored by both the Republicans and the Democrats. These hollowed out buildings are very poignant in that. So I feel seen, I think, was enough to mobilize people.
That's actually thank you. Because I wish I had said what she said. Because what I mean by cross-cutting cleavage issues is not what a typical political science treatment of that would be, that it's about the price of eggs. It's more like it's about the sense of a lack of meaning that has been stripped from me and from my community. So this would be Arlie Hochschild's work, Stolen Pride or Strangers in Their Own Land, or other similar bodies of work that looks at the lost sense of identity and meaning that entire parts of the country have experienced. And so thank you for that.